Hello, in this video I'm going to be introducing and talking about one of my favorite authors, which is Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe was primarily a science fiction and fantasy author. Like I said, he's one of my favorites, certainly my favorite science fiction author. This video will be discussing his life, some key events in his life, and some key aspects of who he was that influenced his writing. I'll be going over some of his most well-known works, the ones I most highly recommend, the ones that have most influenced me. I'll talk about more personally why I love him, and more generally why I love him, his writing style, how unique it is, whether he might be someone you should check out reading. And then at the end, we may also touch on some other authors that he was influenced by, some other authors that he influenced, and kind of the time period he was writing in and how that affected all of his works. Okay. Gene Wolfe primarily grew up in Texas, and like most science fiction and fantasy authors, he fell in love with reading from a very early age, but he initially actually spent a lot of his life as an engineer. He initially attended Texas A&M University, but unfortunately left the university to join the Korean War as a combat engineer. That war would have a big impact on him, as you can see in some interviews, which I'll mention some of those interviews later. But he got through it, no major injuries or anything, and he would come back and finish his degree at University of Houston and become an industrial engineer. So he would work as an engineer. Probably his biggest thing that he contributed to was actually the Pringles machine. He made a contribution to that. But later in his engineering career, he would primarily be a journal editor, actually. He worked as the primary editor, the senior editor for Plant Engineering, which was a journal that was published. And he often mentions in writing that most of his writing experience was actually writing nonfiction about engineering in this journal. During this time, and I believe after the war, he would go on to marry Rosemary, and she was a very devout Catholic. Due to this marriage, he would become interested in Catholicism and eventually convert. And that religion and that religious devotion would play a very major role in a lot of his works, a lot of the themes. And you can really see that as you get into different books of his. And that's a large part of why I fell in love with him and how he has had an impact on me. So eventually he would retire from writing for the Plant Engineering Journal and become just a science fiction and fantasy writer full-time. A lot of his works, though, were initially published while he was doing both, working as an engineer editor and working as a science fiction and fantasy writer. Wolfe would spend most of his life in Illinois, actually, once he got out of Texas, where he grew up. Eventually, he would move to Peoria, Illinois, and unfortunately lose his wife Rosemary a few years before his own death. Wolfe died at home in Peoria due to cardiovascular disease in 2019, but he lived, I believe, 87 years, so a good life, and I think he did a lot with that time. As you're going to see later, he was a very prolific author, wrote a lot extensively, both short stories and full-length novels, and a few full-length series, which is primarily what I've read and what we'll be discussing today. The most significant thing to note when discussing Wolfe's writing style is his prose and how flexible he was with it. Almost all of his books are written with some type of unreliable narrator, which basically means you can't trust the person who's writing it, and that's because it's not written from a third-person omniscient narrator or Wolfe talking about the story from his own perspective, but rather there's a character in the story writing about the story. This could be a character writing about somebody else's adventure in third person, or with most of his books, it could be a character in first person writing about events that have happened to them in the past. These characters are unreliable for a number of reasons. They could be straight up lying to you. They could be just kind of bragging and slightly distorting the events that happen to make themselves look better. They could have amnesia, as happens in some of his works, so they literally can't remember what they're writing about. They could just be naive and a little bit stupid, and they just simply don't understand what's happening to them themselves, so how could they describe it to you? Because of this, Wolfe's writing style can be very, very elusive and dense, and you're trying to kind of pick apart not just what the author, this writer, is telling you, but how much bias they're putting into it and what's really happening through this. This also means his prose is very adaptable to the book, because he writes in the style of the person writing. For example, in the Book of the New Sun, which is one of his major works, which we'll discuss in more detail later, the character is not a very nice person. He has a lot of growth, and he gets better later in the series, but he's not a nice person. He's very egotistical, to put it in one word, and he also has some very, what we would consider morally incorrect viewpoints, very misogynistic, very aggressive, and so this is kind of written into the book, and you have to understand while reading that this is not Wolfe's opinion. this is the in-book character discussing his past events from his own perspective. Because of this, you also have his prose slightly changing in complexity from book to book. The Book of the New Sun, which I just mentioned, is very complex, and he tried to not invent any words like some fantasy authors do, but tried to use instead archaic words that are from English or other languages that we don't use anymore as his only vocabulary. So the Book of the New Sun contains many ancient words which are actually being used to describe future events and kind of being repurposed or used. And it's a very flowery, kind of over-the-top, philosophical sounding writing. But in other works, such as The Wizard Knight, it's much more straightforward and to the point. So as you'll see, as you go into reading his works, his prose consistently changes, but it's consistently amazing. A lot of the value in writing and reading Gene Wolfe is not just the overarching plot and characters, which those are amazing, we'll get to those, but it's in the moment-to-moment sentences and how just kind of the depth of emotion he's so easily able to express with his writing. The first of Gene Wolfe's writings that I'll be discussing is the solar cycle. Now, the solar cycle is actually a collection of series. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to call it 3 series. And each of these are connected to each other, some more so than others. And each of them has pretty unique stories, though. So the first one, and the most well-known, is the Book of the New Sun. Now, the Book of the New Sun actually consists of 4 books, but I have the omnibus editions, which are the easiest ones to get your hands on nowadays. So the first book is, the omnibus edition is Shadow and Claw, but the name of the actual books is The Shadow of the Torturer and The Claw of the Concealer. Book 3 is The Sword of the Lictor, and Book 4 is The Citadel of the Artarch. And finally, you have a 5th book, which was not originally part of the series, so that's why I said it's kind of 3 series. Some people consider this coda as being entirely separate. I read it right after reading the first 4 books, and I think at this point, most of you would want to read it. It's hard to not want to read it after finishing the other ones. And then that is the Earth of the New Sun. So there's 5 books in this series. And the Book of the New Sun is Gene Wolfe's most well-known work, certainly. It's not my favorite by any means, but people love it just because of how unique the setting is and how well told and beautiful and sometimes obscenely complex the storytelling can get. It takes place in what's called the Dying Earth subgenre, and we'll talk about Jack Vance later, who's another author who kind of created the subgenre and influenced Gene Wolfe. But the Dying Earth is it's on Earth, set so far in the future that the sun is kind of faded to big red blur and it's like all but fading away. And technology has advanced so far and then it regressed again that it almost reads like a fantasy book some points because many of the characters don't have any access to the sci-fi technology that does exist. And the Earth is kind of fading away and crumbling, and as the characters explore these continents and cities, you realize that they're not walking on a forest, they're walking on the ruins of ancient sci-fi cities, right? Which are now ancient and for us would be far in the future. So it's very, very far in the future, but not in that everybody has crazy sci-fi technology, but rather that things have regressed back culturally and very few people even live on the Earth. So the main character that we follow is Severian, and Severian is a torturer, and he's being raised in the Guild of Torturers. So most of Earth is controlled by one government, and when they need people tortured to get information out of them, they send them to the aptly named Guild of Torturers. Severian, we initially follow him as a pretty young boy, but within the first few chapters, he ages up to maybe 20 or so, I don't know, and spends the rest of the book at that age. Now, Severian is actually writing this book as his future self, so he is the author, and he's writing this past history of what happened to him through the first 4 books, and then the 5th book, the Coda, is what's now presently happening to him. You have to keep in mind when reading this series that is all from the perspective of Severian. He has some very twisted opinions on certain things and has some serious character flaws, some of which he improves and grows through, some of which he does not. And he also likes to leave things out. He likes to brag about things, he likes to leave things out that he's not proud of. So it's you have to kind of piece together what is really happening. So what does happen in the story? Well, Severian, once he reaches a certain age, gets his first torture assignment into this pretty lady, and he falls in love with her essentially and can't bring himself to properly torture her. So he has mercy on her, not by letting her go, but by giving her a knife by which she can kill herself with. That's his crime essentially, and the Guild of Torturers are not allowed to do that. But the master of the guild, or one of the masters, likes Severian, so he doesn't want to kill Severian himself. Rather, he releases him and says, you have a new job. you're going to be the executioner of this city far off. So you have to go on this hike essentially and go get to the city and get your new job as an executioner. That is the opening to the story, but we basically follow a Severian gets tangled in all these complex things, and there's prophecies connected to him and all these. It feels very fantasy, like at some points feels very sci-fi like later in the series. And it's basically what is happening to him and how he eventually becomes, as you pretty quickly learn, because it's current time Severian writing about his past, the autarch, which is the ruler of this dying earth. I love the series. When I first read it, it was my favorite series, science fiction wise, but was quickly replaced by other Gene Wolfe series, which became my new favorites and still are my favorites to this day. It's beautiful. It's very complex. The writing is very, very flowery. And it's just, there's so much detail packed in that's so much fun to read. Severian, as a writer, is very philosophical. He likes to go on tangents about things that he finds interesting, or things he thinks about what happened in the past, and kind of giving his own ideas of what may have happened, but you don't know as a reader if his ideas are correct or not. It's just a fascinating read. This is by far the most well-known of Gene Wolfe's works, so it's very covered on YouTube if you want to go read more about it or hear other people talk about it. But what I'm excited about with this video is to talk about the series that aren't as often talked about. And these are also in the solar cycle, so they take place in the same universe and are connected, though you don't realize how tightly connected they are till later in the series. And that is the Book of the Long Sun, which is 4 books again, and then the Book of the Short Sun, which I've, again, the omnibus edition, and this is 3 books. And these two series are much more intimately connected. So the Book of the Long Sun takes place on this massive flying spaceship called the Whirl. As you can maybe see in this cover, the Whirl is essentially a massive cylinder shape, and they live on the inside of the Whirl. Down the middle of the cylinder, there's a sun with light coming out of it like a lamp that rotates to give day to some parts of the cylinder, and some parts get nighttime. So you have titles like Night Side of the Long Sun, where it's night side because the night part of the sun is facing them and it's nighttime. The series follows a priest, actually, but not of any religion we have here on Earth. It's kind of vaguely modeled off Greek and Roman religions, but there's a lot of Catholicism in it as well. It's very interesting to follow. And the priest is named Patera Silk. And Silk is one of my favorite characters in all of writing that I've read. Basically what happens is he works in this church, or what they call a mansion, and this church is also a schoolyard, and he teaches the boys with some of the other nuns that work there, Matera as they call them, Matera Marble, Matera Mint, Matera Rose. And basically this church is bought up by this local gang leader, and they don't want that to happen. Patera Silk is panicked. He doesn't want all these children to not have school education, and he doesn't want the district that he works for, the quarter, to not have a church to go to. So he decides, I'm going to go steal back the property rights to my own building from this gang leader. So the first book follows him, Night Side of the Long Sun, as he tries to go rob this gang leader of his property rights back. But just like Book of the New Sun, things quickly scale up, and it's no longer this local story about just him, but this entire story about the city that he lives in, which is a pretty large city, and how he becomes evolved as a very powerful leader in this city with this rebellion that's going on. And then eventually it takes place and it affects the whole world that they live in, this massive flying spaceship. This series is just beautiful. The religious tones that were very much so in Book of the New Sun, but a little bit more hidden, not quite hidden, become very obvious in Book of the Long Sun, not because Gene Wolfe is just presenting his religion very obtusely, trying to advertise it to you, but because the religion within this flying spaceship was kind of poorly modeled by the people who made the spaceship off of real Earth religions, including maybe Christianity or Catholicism. And basically, Patera Silk begins through the story to realize that a lot of the gods that they sacrifice to maybe don't deserve that, and that maybe instead the one god that he does find a true connection with, called the Outsider, maybe is the true god. There's no clear answer to this, but the way Gene Wolfe writes about this, and the way he talks about religion, and the way the character of Patera Silk is written, and how beautiful his story is, and how kind and loving he is, really kind of had an influence on me, and made me start taking my own religion more seriously, and start considering some of the things Gene Wolfe was writing about. This series, like I said, is less well-known than Book of the New Sun. On the surface level, it seems less complex. It seems like, oh, I understand what's going on a little bit more than you might understand New Sun, but it has just as much complexity. It's just even better hidden. there's a lot of layers to how it's written and what's going on, and when you reread it, you kind of begin to see these things that you missed the first time, and there's a big spoiler at the end of the series, which I don't want to spoil for you guys, but how do I phrase this gently and correctly? So the series is written in third person, unlike Book of the New Sun, it's not first person, but the narrator is still unreliable, and you kind of have to learn and work around that as you go through it. So Book of the Long Sun builds up and connects to the third and final series, which is my personal favorite science fiction series of all time, and is much more directly connected to Book of the Long Sun than Book of the New Sun is to either, and that is Book of the Short Sun. It is 3 books, this is the omnibus edition, and it follows a character, I'm not gonna tell which, character from Book of the Long Sun after the flying spaceship they're on lands on these planets, and they all start to move and immigrate into these planets and live their lives on the 3 planets of blue, which is a mostly ocean-covered world, green, which is mostly jungle-covered world, and the original world, which is the spaceship they were in. Now, they call it Book of the Short Sun because there's a normal sun, what we think of as a sun, instead of the long sun going down the middle, so that's why they call it that. And you follow this character as he goes on this quest essentially to the new town they founded, which is based off of the town in Book of the Long Sun, is really struggling. There's a lot of issues and dangers in this planet. There's a lot of issues and dangers between people as they fight with each other and rob from one another. And you follow the main character, again, writing like Severian, once he's finished his story, kind of, as he's writing about what happened to him in the past. And you learn about his adventures he goes on as he tries to essentially find Silk from the first story and bring Silk back to their new town to be the governor again. The series is incredibly melancholic and sad and somber compared to Book of the Long Sun, and that sounds like a maybe insult or unfun thing, but it's my favorite book series of all time for a good reason. It's beautifully written, and the level of emotion and just kind of sadness that he's able to express through this character really touched me when I first read it. I'm going on my second read right now, and it's touching me again greatly, which is why I wanted to make this video. I think Book of the Short Sun is a very beautiful finisher to the whole solar cycle, and it, in a way I don't want to spoil, connects back to Book of the New Sun. And it's just beautifully written, which I think maybe the best thing I could do is actually just read some of the lines. So there's so many beautiful lines I could find. I was trying to remember which ones because some of them I haven't read in a little bit. But first I'll actually start with, I'll start with the quote from Book of the Short Sun, just to give you an idea of how beautiful some of the writing is. And like I said, a lot of the beauty in Gene Wolfe doesn't just come from the overarching stories, though I love the complexity of them, but rather the minute-to-minute writing and how much emotion he's able to express with these characters and what they're saying, what they're going through. Just as an example, the main character of Book of the Short Sun is writing about his job, his current job, as the governor and the judge and the military commander and everything, the ruler of the small town he's ruling. The book alternates between him writing about his adventures he's had and what's going on in the current town he's living in. And he writes, "Rain and more rain all day long. I held court and heard 3 cases. It is hard to be fair in such foul weather. There is that in me that wants to punish everyone, but I try hard to be fair, and to point out to everyone who appears before me that if only they themselves had been fair, they would not have to come to me for justice. This I say in one fashion to one, and in another to another. Still, I thank the outsider and all the lesser gods that I had no criminal cases today. The impressions of his fingers are on all these quarreling, handsome, mud-colored people, but the light is bad on such days as this, and it can be terribly hard to see them." So as I said, the writing's beautiful, and the religious tones become even more strong in this book, and I think for people who like religious writings, I think this book will connect with you on a level that most science fiction fantasy books won't, except for maybe Lord of the Rings. But for those who aren't religious and don't find that necessarily appealing, I wouldn't let you put that away from this book. They're by no means explicitly religious, but rather Gene Wolfe struggles with some of the things that religious people would struggle with, and that struggles are put into his characters and what they're going through. So it's not necessarily about religion is the answer to everything. It's certainly not written like that. Rather, it's about there's these human conditions, and for people who are religious, the way they think about these conditions becomes slightly different for those who maybe don't believe in a god. So as these characters go through these issues, they think about these things, they philosophize about them, and if they're religious, they bring up the religious topics and what they think of it, and how can this world be so troubled with gods. And a lot of the Book of the Short Sun in that way is dealing with the problem of guilt and shame over things you've done. And it's beautifully written and one of my favorite books of all time. So that is Gene Wolfe's most well-known work, which is called The Solar Cycle. Now I'm going to discuss some other works of his. I've unfortunately not read nearly enough of other things he's written, but I can pull them out and show them to you. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, Gene Wolfe has written a number of short stories, and these are collected in a number of volumes. I left those, oh my goodness, left those back there because I have not read enough of them to really talk about them. So I'll talk about what I have read. The first and longest series that I have read, separate from the Solar Cycle, is his fantasy series, The Wizard Knight. Again, this is an omnibus edition. They're cheaper to buy, so I have all of them. And it consists of 2 books, and the order of the book is actually The Knight is the first one, The Wizard is the second one. I don't know why the omnibus is called The Wizard Knight. It's a fantasy series following a young boy as he gets kidnapped into this fantasy world. And as Gene Wolfe mentions in an interview,
what I came up with was the notion of medieval chivalry having occurred in a universe without Christianity.
It's a very fascinating book. It's a much simpler writing style. Again, he adapts his prose to the book. You follow the main character after he's completed all of his adventures and is living peacefully in this fantasy world, and he figures out that he can get a letter back to his brother in the human world. So he's writing this letter, and the whole book is his letter to his brother describing the things that happened to him. Very early on in the book, though he's a young boy, some magic spell is cast on him, or some time passes in some weird way that he can't remember, and he becomes a full-grown adult. So he still has the mentality of a boy. He needs to grow up, but he's a full-grown adult. He's a knight, eventually becomes a wizard. And he also falls madly in love with this tree goddess, for lack of a better word. And a lot of it's about him seeking to find her again and marry her and live with her. And a lot of it is about the struggles they face along the way and the evil in this world, but also the goodness and the knightliness, essentially, of the people he meets. I love this book. I have not reread it yet. I should reread it, but I'd highly recommend it. If you are a much bigger fantasy reader and you don't think you're in for the whole sci-fi saga of the Solar Cycle, I can highly recommend The Wizard Knight. But I would keep in mind, if you are in that situation, a big fantasy reader, that even the Solar Cycle reads very much like a fantasy, just due to how much emphasis he puts on prose and how much kind of seemingly magic there is going on. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. But yeah, Wizard Knight's excellent. Book I've not finished, but another one of his more well-known series is The Fifth Head of Service. And now this is actually, I believe, a collection of 3 novellas. Haven't read it, but I've heard it highly recommended for people who want a much shorter and slimmer introduction to Gene Wolfe. So yeah, maybe check out the Wikipedia and see what it says about it. The one other Gene Wolfe I have read enough to talk about is the Soldier of the Mist series. There is a 3rd book. I don't own it yet, but the 4th book is Soldier of the Mist. And this book is, again, a fascinating use of an unreliable narrator, but in a much more unique way. So the setting is this ancient Greek world that's very similar to Greece, but the gods and the magic going on are very real and present, right? And our main character gets cursed by one of the gods, and every day when he goes to sleep, he forgets the day that happened previously. So this doctor has this idea, well, here's this scroll, here's a pencil, and every day I want you to write down, before you go to bed, write down what happened to you, and the next morning you can read it. And we are reading, unedited, unfiltered, what he wrote down in his scroll. So each day he forgets his memory, new things happen, and it's a wonderful tale of him trying to figure out meeting new people, meeting them again and again every morning as he forgets his memory, relying on them, trusting them as he tries to figure out how he can break this curse. And he has the upside of this curse that's put on him is he's very close to the gods, and he can very much feel their presence in this Greek world. So when other people look over some deity hiding in some common form, he can see them and talk to them and get to know them. It's just a fascinating series. Very fun. It goes very quick, in my opinion. So if you're a big fan of kind of historical and mythological fiction, I'd check it out. Okay, next up, I'm going to talk about some authors that I very much so associate with Gene Wolfe because they love Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe loved to read them and was influenced by them. The first of these is Jack Vance, who I mentioned earlier, and is arguably the creator of the Dying Earth subgenre through his Tales of the Dying Earth series. Now, this series is a bunch of short stories and novellas, all combined together. Now, it'd be hard to buy single editions again. I get this YouTube video has a lot of omnibus editions. I've not finished every Tales of the Dying Earth volume, not finished all of them, but every one I have read, I've adored. They're very like picturesque books, extremely flowery, over the top, like kind of old style prose, but in a very fun way, and combined with this sci-fi world, which is so beautifully lit by the sun as it fades and flickers away. It's just fascinating to read. Very fun, unique characters, very anti-hero characters who make a lot of mistakes and not necessarily heroes, but certainly fun to follow. The Jack Vance series that I much more love, though, I don't know if Gene Wolfe ever read this. With how much he talked about Jack Vance, I would assume he did. And that is the Lioness trilogy. Now you have Lioness, also called Sergeant's Garden is the first one. You have Lioness 2, which is the Green Pole, and you have Lioness 3, which is Matic. So this series I read recently and is one of my most just fun fantasy series I've ever read. It takes place in a lot of English and French and other lore, but mainly English mythology relating to the King Arthur tales. Talks about these various islands such as Avalon or Lioness, which exist somewhere off the coast of England. And this series makes this place real and calls it the Elder Isles. And there's this other continent about the same size as Britain, floating around south of Britain. And it's just full of magic and trolls and goblins and weird races and magical creatures and magicians. And again, it's very flowery, over-the-top prose, and it's just so fun to read. The characters are so memorable and likable and exciting. It wastes no time. It very action-packed and exciting. I could not recommend a fantasy series more highly just for fun of reading. The one reason I wouldn't say it's like one of my favorites of all time is that it is just a very fun, exciting. There was not a lot of writing or storytelling that really impacted me personally, but it was a blast to read, so I have a hard time insulting it like that. I'd highly recommend the Lioness series. The next series I highly associate with Gene Wolfe. When I think of Gene Wolfe, I think of this author. Is an author I'd hope you've heard of, which is Ursula K. Le Guin. Now I have the whole Tales of Earthsea omnibus right there. Did not bring it down. I brought down my 3 slim copies of the first original trilogy. The Earthsea series is her fantasy series, which is the first Le Guin I read. It starts off kind of as a children's series, but I think any adult would love it, and slowly matures throughout the 6 books. It's excellent. It takes place on this massive archipelago of islands, and it's full of, again, magicians. But unlike Lioness, it really does focus on the morality of these characters. She was very influenced by Taoist. So now that I've talked enough about Christianity in this video, which I am a Christian, she is very Taoist, Ursula K. Le Guin, and that if you want to read about that and you find it fascinating, I'd highly recommend the book series. If you don't, I'd highly recommend it anyway, especially for kids or other people you know who are younger. I think this is one of the best introduction series to fantasy and sci-fi you could talk about. Which, speaking of sci-fi, while Ursula K. Le Guin's best-known series is the Earthsea series, which is fantasy, she was actually primarily a sci-fi author. I'd like to read more of her works, but the only sci-fi one I've read so far is The Left Hand of Darkness, which is part of the Hainish cycle of series, which is kind of a very loosely connected universe. Her sci-fi was very philosophical in nature. It was really dealing with, here are some topics of issue in society, and let's put it into the sci-fi world and see how these very well-written characters deal with it and what happens. This book, just as an example, deals with a society where most of the people living there don't have a set gender. The gender fluctuates every month, and that leads to a completely different society, and you read through it. But the nice thing about it is, unlike some sci-fi authors, just like Gene Wolfe, she doesn't get too buried just in the topic she's dealing with, but rather she stays grounded in good characters and good storytelling. Okay, Those, I think, are some of the authors Gene Wolfe was very influenced by. On some of the back of Gene Wolfe's books, you'll see an Ursula K. Le Guin quote, for example. Yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin says, "A masterpiece, the best science fiction I've read in years." On another one, she says, Gene Wolfe is today's Melville. And Jack Vance was very influential in the setting of the Book of the New Sun, so I'd highly recommend Jack Vance for that reason. And there's actually a quote I'd like to read from the Book of the New Sun, the very first book, The Shadow of the Torturer. And it is when Severian is going through this ancient library as a little kid. He's walking along with the librarian, and the librarian says, "In every library, by ancient precept, is a room reserved for children. In it are kept bright picture books, such as children delight in, and a few simple tales of wonder and adventure. Many children come to these rooms, and so long as they remain within their confines, no interest is taken in them. From time to time, however, a librarian remarks a solitary child, still of tender years, who wanders from the children's room, and at last deserts it entirely. Such a child eventually discovers on some low but obscure shelf the Book of Gold. You have never seen this book, and you will never see it, being past the age at which it is meant." What Gene Wolfe is talking about here is the idea that people who fall in love with reading, often as children, find some book that really, really connects with them. And Gene Wolfe said in an interview, I believe, that Jack Vance's The Dying Earth was that book for him, and it made him fall in love with reading. It made him want to become a writer himself. For me, that book is the works by Gene Wolfe, specifically the Book of the Short Sun, that really just connected with me and has made me love reading in a more thorough and more deep way. So those are some authors that Gene Wolfe was close to, maybe not personally in life, though I know he knew Ursula K. Le Guin. So I'm gonna move on to the next part. I'd like to spend a section of the video kind of narrowing down on the topics discussed in the Book of the Long Sun and the Book of the Short Sun, and specifically the Christian and Catholic overtones and how much they have influenced me. If you want to skip this section, go for it, but I'd like to talk about it. The Book of the Long Sun, as you mentioned, follows a priest, and he kind of realizes that the gods that they sacrifice to, which are based off kind of any pantheon of gods in the real world, so the Romans, the Greeks, or the Norse, other ones as well that I'm not remembering, Egyptian gods perhaps, that many of them are false, and they're false in a very real way because the spaceship he lives on was set up by these humans who pretended to be these gods. But he finds solace in one true God that he does feel a connection to, and that is the outsider. Now, I've always interpreted, at least in some sense, though there's a more literal reading sense where it could be another character, but in the allegorical sense, the outsider as being the Christian God in the real world, because canonically, the series does take place in our universe, so if Gene Wolfe, as a Christian, is writing the series, God still exists in that universe. The outsider is the outsider because he's the god of outcasts, of lonely people, of the outside world, outside of space and time. He's not confined to the spaceship, and in that way he's very similar to the Christian God. And there's many more lines in the book that point to him being a very explicit allegory of the Christian God. But the themes Gene Wolfe is able to discuss with this semi-presence of religious topics are beautiful to me. This is most noticeable in the Book of the Short Sun, where you follow the character as he tries to seek Silk from the previous series and bring him back. This seeking of Silk and this trying to search for this, what he sees as the ideal person, the best person, is really a very beautiful story of our search for God and our search for the perfect person. And in fact, there's parts of this book that I don't want to spoil, but a lot of it is about the main character imitating Silk and trying to become like Silk. He writes that sometimes he'll say a sentence, and briefly, just then, he spoke as Silk would speak. And just like that, we hope as Christians to speak as Jesus would speak, as God would speak, to let God speak through us, to say it that way. The Book of the Short Sun is beautiful with these messages and these themes. And you just watch as Horn, who is such a, that's the main character of the series, such a struggled and troubled character, as he makes these mistakes and really feels the shame and the overwhelming guilt of these mistakes, but finds solace in his search to be like Silk, so search to be holy in the way Silk was holy, to be kind and loving in the way Silk was kind and loving. And he always brings up this topic of, what would Silk do? And it's kind of like that old joke, that old line, what would Jesus do if he was here? But I just highly recommend the series for anybody who wants to think about some of these topics, even if you're not necessarily religious. Okay, I don't know if I did justice to this author as much as I wish I could. Maybe I'll have to come back and talk about more specific topics in other videos. But all in all, Gene Wolfe is a beautiful author with beautiful writing, very complex works, but that's not where I've fallen in love with him. I've fallen in love rather with his moment-to-moment writing and the characters he's able to write and how deeply and truly they feel their emotions. He reminds me very much so of classical authors in that way, which I'll talk about in other videos. I will be linking in the description of this video a playlist that I've assembled of all interviews on YouTube I could find of Gene Wolfe. Some of these interviews are unlisted, so there's no way to access them unless you have the direct link, unfortunately, so hopefully the playlist will help you guys with that. Gene Wolfe was very much so a unique personality, in love with writing, in love with the Lord, and he just loved sci-fi fantasy. He loved talking about it and writing about it, so check out those interviews if you have an interest. If you're already a fan of him, certainly check them out. If you're interested in who he is, check them out. I'll also be maybe linking in the description the subreddit of Gene Wolfe. Normally, Reddits are not places you should be spending much time, but the subreddit of Gene Wolfe is good for people who have read Gene Wolfe. Please don't go there. You're gonna get spoilers if you haven't read him. But they really break down some of the plot complexities in ways I can't, because that's not the reason I read Gene Wolfe. I try to pay attention to them and understand them, but he's a very complex writer and he likes hiding secrets in his books, suffice to say. And the Reddit is very kind. It is people do put a lot of hours into unpacking his works. So if you have read something such as the Book of the New Sun, go check that out. My big message for this YouTube video is please check out Gene Wolfe. And if you've have checked out Gene Wolfe in the Book of the New Sun, please continue and read The Long Sun and The Short Sun, because thematically they just really touched me in a way that the New Sun only just scratched the surface of. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.